We are here at the IBC for THEO's School of Streaming. We have an industry leader here. Please introduce yourself and your company, please.
My name is Peter Chave. I'm a principal architect at Akamai in the media engineering division.
Peter, tell me about your experience so far in the low latency area, because this is really the buzzword of the trade show, I have the impression.
I think I've been walking around here, and if you could take a thesaurus and look up synonyms for low, small, reduced. So I've seen ultra low latency, real-time streaming. But they all come down to it's a number. What should the streaming be? So a demonstration we've been doing over on our booth is really the question that broadcasters have been asking us, which is not so much, can you give me the lowest possible latency? I want to get the stream there in 100 milliseconds. It's, can you make my OTT experience and my traditional experiences be the same?
And in terms of the same, what is the number that I still may ask?
Well, that's the thing, because if you look at traditional experiences, as a consumer, everyone thinks that's live. If I'm watching the sports game, I think I'm watching it at the same time that everyone in the stadium is doing. But that's really not true, because even the fastest service probably today is at least 5 seconds behind studio. So live is actually 5 seconds in the past. And so when we're talking about what's the lowest latency you want to get to, if as a broadcaster I just want to make my OTT experience line up with my broadcast experience, so I don't have this disparity where there's somebody in one room watching it on a set-top box, but then somebody else watching it on a Roku upstairs, and downstairs they hear, whoa, oh,
yeah, the spoiled experience.
The spoiled experience. Last night, my family were watching the Patriots game against the Dolphins. My daughters decided to be Dolphins fans for the night, but that didn't go so well. 43-0.
Oh,
but
really?
Had they been watching it on an iPad versus watching it on, say, the DirecTV feed, there would have been a disparity in the experience of when they saw the goals going against them. So when people talk about low latency, it's talking about what's the right latency. And so what we've been promoting and what we've been supporting now for probably the last couple of years, I've been doing this demonstration, feels like, for the last few shows now, is showing off characteristics of CMAF as a container format. Yes. And as the industry transitions from RTMP and from MPEG-TS as the underlying container format, CMAF, if you're not familiar, CMAF stands for Common Media Application Format. And this was kind of the grand alliance between the Apple ecosystem and the Dash ecosystem and the industry at large, which was one container and one media format in the origin.
Finally.
Yeah, indeed. But then you could describe it with different manifests. So if you wanted to have it supported on different ecosystems, you're really just manipulating a text file. You're just changing this manifest file, rather than breaking the origin, breaking the cache, and having to store two versions of the object. We didn't quite get there with encryption yet, but
that was going to be my. Did we achieve the Holy Grail or not?
So we're at that point because the industry kind of agreed that we would coalesce on CBCS mode. Mm-hmm. So this is the way you initialize them. We agreed on common encryption, but then there were two different initialization vectors, which meant the actual bytes were incompatible. And what we're dealing with is really a legacy problem right now, which is there are platforms that only support the other mode.
Okay, so we're stuck for
chain block cipher versus counter mode. So
that's potentially 10 years or something.
I honestly believe it's probably only about 12 months before we're in a reasonable position where you could say, if I don't have an encrypted service, there's absolutely no reason to not be on CMAF now. Okay, because you look at the 99.7% of active Android users, 97% of iOS are on a version that would support CMAF. The browsers will support it. So in terms of platform support, we're in a pretty good shape there from my potential as a distributor or a publisher, who my target audience is and my target platforms. There's really good coverage for CMAF.
You touched upon Android and Apple, two different ecosystems with slightly different approaches. What's your experience so far with dealing this dual environment, and how does CMAF fit in that equation, but also in terms of low latency?
Yeah, so particularly on low latency, and I think that's really a hot topic right now, especially with the announcement back in June from Apple on this topic. So let me explain how the CMAF one works, which is we do this thing called chunked encoding, which CMAF basically is just a container, and it contains a header and then a data block. So in the past, you would send a header and then say 6 seconds of video. Now, I couldn't send the whole file because I couldn't write in the header the length of the data block until I'd finished the 6 seconds. You don't know how long it's going to be. So I can't have the header incomplete. So I would wait and I'd write my move header. I would then calculate how long my MDAT section's going to be.
Oh, it's getting complicated here, but people are still following.
Yeah, hopefully. So I had to wait until I'd finished the whole segment before I sent it. Chunked encoding means I can send the header and a small bit of data, maybe a few frames of video, but I can then concatenate these headers and data blocks together into a single file. So I'm still sending one file, but I'm able to send the file in bits as I'm making it, which means as a player side, I can start receiving the bits before I finish the whole
latency.
So rather than spending 6 seconds or 2 seconds in the encoder, that time is now buffer available at the player. So since I have the time in the player, I can drive my latency lower, or I can set latency as a target as opposed to an artifact of I had to wait for 3 segments to arrive and then start playing the first one, or some arbitrary rule that would determine my latency indirectly by technological choices I chose upstream. So that's been the big shift, is players choosing their latency, not having the latency determined to them. So dash low latency, that's the way it works. Use chunk transfer, chunked encoded and chunk transferred files across the wire through the CDN to the device. So there was from the HLS world, from Apple space, before Apple released their spec, there was actually another spec that was published by the folks over at THEOplayer and by the community, which basically this is what Twitch and Twitter had been promoting.
Yeah, the community
HLS. So this was basically a way of, I would write the manifest, which is then backwardly compatible with my HLS players, but I would write a new tag that was secret or special called Prefetch. And what that would do is that would tell you the name of the file of the chunk coming.
Would come,
So you could ask for it ahead of time without breaking the legacy players. And that seemed like a very elegant solution because the objects are identical to the ones on the wire, and these are the same as the ones, it's completely compatible with the dash. Now, for a couple of reasons, when Apple published their spec, they actually took a slightly different tack. And their stated reasons were that there was maybe inconsistent support for this fully end-to-end chunked encoding, which as a CDN that supported that, we didn't see that, but then I'm not familiar with the rest of the ecosystem, so that may be, and also there was a question around bandwidth estimation. And these, I think, at least this is what I've heard. I don't know if this is, I'm not speaking on their behalf, but this is what I believe were two of the driving forces for the way they decided to re-architect HLS in the newer version, which they've called LLHLS or HLS v9. And so what they do now is you describe the last segment before, but now rather than sending the file name of the whole segment and doing chunk transfer, they actually break that file up into small parts, as they call them. So say 200, 300 millisecond files, and then send those across the wire so that you can then request the very bleeding edge of the playlist.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. So rather than waiting for 4 seconds worth of data, I can receive 200 milliseconds, 200 milliseconds, 200 milliseconds.
Okay, so
the downside, as we see, is that makes the protocol very chatty because I got to ask
quite
for
a lot of interactions, and I understood also that it requires HTTP 2.0
so HTTP,
and push. Is that an issue?
So HTTP 2 is not an issue because that's really been a feature of CDNs for a while. That's been 40% of all websites use H2 already. So that's and as a web developer, H2 is just an option you pick in the UI. I turn it on my Nginx, my Apache, my CDN. I say, yes, please enable H2. And then goodness happens. I get header compression, I get multiplexing of connections, I get a faster SSL connection, I get all of this goodness happens. And I just sit back and go, yay, I made my website better. But but push in itself is very lightly used. And the reason is, it's not just turn it on and goodness, it's turn it on and then tune and refine. Because if you get it wrong, it actually degrades your performance. You're pushing too much content. So somebody just simply wanted to see an update of a news headline on a website, maybe getting pushed all the videos and objects on the page each time. But you really want to just push anything that you want to push all the objects that are in the first round trip time, so that the player can then. Websites are so complex and dynamic these days. So it's hard to predict what you need to send at that moment. So that's why HTTP push is very lightly supported, and that's been one of the sticking points of the industry right now. Is just the lack of support for push. Now we do have a great demonstration. If you'd like to come over,
so I saw
you can come and see
Dash, and I was very impressed to see what you already achieved. And did you manage to correctly implement ABR ladders and so forth?
That's right. So we're working through something. It's still a draft spec. We're only a couple of months in now.
Yeah.
We've got a few people building packages, like yourself building players.
Exactly.
So the ecosystem's kind of looking at it, and then kind of we're working through the issues. And Apple have been very responsive to the feedback from the community. They got a lot of feedback initially, like, oh, what is this? All these new things here. But they're moving the conversation forward. We're exploring, and push in its own right is not a major problem. Is actually a good thing, and that solves one of the key problems with HLS for me, which was when you ask for the segment, I always go and ask. When I ask for a playlist, the thing I always want next is the playlist, the segment at the head of the playlist. So it's almost the poster child of how push should be used. Just we've got to make sure it all hangs together. There's other goodness in HLS like Delta playlists. If I've got like a 2-hour event, I don't have to download 100.
Yeah, that's a major issue with HLS, the massive manifest files.
Just give me the last 10 minutes of the manifest. That's a really cool feature. Adding all these extra parameters as a CDN that has the cache things, that's kind of a headache. I mean, we can cache the keys, that's not a problem, but you create the potential for us duplicating objects in the cache, or having objects that are really, really similar, which is maybe a suboptimal. You also have to make the origin much more active now, which it really wasn't.
Connections.
And that was one of the beauties of HLS in the past, was an origin could be as simple as just a generic
web service
or a file store. I mean, you could serve it from a NAS if you had to, but that was the beauty. It was just a file, and as long as you sequence them, it all worked. So I think there's a lot of new things in the spec that will generally improve the ecosystem. I think there's a way, actually, there's lots of proposals up in the air right now of how we can synthesize the parts from the segments, and how we can stop duplicating the origin anyway. And I think this will come together. So.
And what's your expected time it will take before we have worked through all the...
We literally just had an update on Wednesday with some new, in the reference tool, Seamap was added, which is great, and they turned on some more tools, and they shifted some of the recommendations and gave some different, kind of guide points for different latencies. So, I think the dash is very well formed. There's the community specs out there. I think LLHLS definitely kind of gives us a framework that's going to be officially supported in AV Foundation, which makes app development, at least in the Apple ecosystem,
for sure,
is great. So I think there's a lot of goodness here. I think we're just going to work through some kind of fun,
the interoperability, like with Dash, LL, with all protocols.
And as an engineer who's on this video, it just makes my days interesting.
It's exciting times.
Keeps me gainfully employed.
Thanks, Pete, for attending this School of Streaming. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter.